A few days after the race at Long Beach, Soyuz 39 blasted off from the Baikonur Cosmodrome in the Kazakh Republic, on its way to spend a week docked with the Salyut space station performing a variety of experiments. The two cosmonauts on board were Vladimir Janibekov, a native of the Uzbek Republic, as well as the first Mongolian in space, Yugderdmin Gurichan. He was officially recognized as the second Asian in space, with Pham Tuan of Vietnam having become the first a year earlier, though for the purposes of these things all Soviet cosmonauts were treated as European, though Janibekov himself on this mission was also from Central Asia. Indeed, he'd taken his wife's surname to memorialize her descent from Janibeg, a 14th century head of the Mongol Golden Horde. I apologise incidentally to any Mongolian or Vietnamese viewers I may have for probably absolutely butchering the pronunciation of their cosmonauts' names. In London, a new political party was launched, the Social Democratic Party, or SDP, by four prominent former Labour Party members who felt the party had swung too far to the left under the influence of trades unions and the Militant Tendency group, and was alienating voters. The so-called Gang of Four, Roy Jenkins, David Owen, Bill Rogers and Shirley Williams, were all former cabinet ministers. Over the course of 1981, 28 Labour MPs and one Conservative, the wonderfully named Christopher Brocklebank Fowler, defected to the party, as well as 9 Labour Lords. Although definitely a break away from the Labour Party, they were hoping to attract voters from across the political spectrum who found Thatcher too far right and Michael Foot too far left. And on the day of the Brazilian Grand Prix, the first London Marathon was run, founded by Chris Brasher and John Disley, both former Olympic steeplechasers. Brasher won gold in Melbourne in 1956, and Disley took bronze in Helsinki 4 years earlier. Chris Brasher, now a journalist, had run in the 1979 New York City Marathon and wrote an article for The Observer praising the greatest folk festival the world has ever seen, and decided to try and do something similar in London. More than 20,000 applications to run were received, of which 6,747 were accepted and 6,255 made it to the finish line. The first to do so were American Dick Beardsley and Norwegian Inger Simonsen, neither of whom had won a marathon before, and agreed as they approached the finish line to hold hands and cross it together. The women's race was won by Joyce Smith, an experienced distance runner who became the first British woman and the first woman over 40 to complete the marathon in less than 2.5 hours, and the following year she won the marathon at the age of 44, a record that still stands. The Grand Prix circus arrived in Rio de Janeiro that last weekend in March to a change in circuit since the previous year. Since its inception in 1972 as a test event, and then entry into the championship in 1973, the Brazilian Grand Prix had usually been held at the long, winding and very bumpy Interlagos circuit in Sao Paulo. But in 1978 the race had been held at the newly renovated Jacarepagua circuit in a working-class suburb of Rio. Table flat and built on marshland, it wasn't the ideal place for a race in many ways, but on the other hand Rio was a much more attractive destination for the glamorous world of F1 and its sponsors than the industrial slums of Sao Paulo. Jacarepagua wasn't able to raise enough sponsorship to keep the race, so it returned to Interlagos for 1979 and 80, but became the subject of a near boycott in 1980 over safety concerns. The race went ahead on that occasion, but the point was taken, and for 1981 the race was back at Jacarepagua for the next few years at least, while major, expensive and time-consuming upgrades were made to the other circuit, including nearly halving its length. The controversy over the Lotus 88 continued in the gap between races. Colin Chapman had appealed the car's ban at Long Beach, with the Automobile Competition Committee for the US, ACUS, and the body agreed that the car was legal, but FISA quickly stepped in and ruled that that decision was only valid in the US. In Brazil, Lotus again brought the car, and once more there was a flood of protests. The rules stated that the car must touch the ground when 2 tyres were deflated, and the stewards demonstrated that it didn't until they leaned heavily on the suspended bodywork. So the car was ruled illegal once again, with Chapman now suspecting the hand of Bernie Ecclestone, which would be a bit rich considering the trick suspension on his own car, which didn't go unnoticed by journalists who spotted the side skirts actually curling under the bodywork at speed. But who was going to protest against the race organiser and spokesman for the teams? Nobody, it seemed. Elsewhere in the paddock, Ken Tyrrell rented his second car for the 2 South American races to ex-Brabham driver Ricardo Zunino, while Mo Nunn signed an obscure but apparently well-funded Colombian who rejoiced in the name of Ricardo Londoño-Bridge to replace Marc Sera for the race, though the Swiss driver had travelled with the team to do a bit of pre-race testing. McLaren were still persisting with the M29F, but hoped to introduce their new MP4 at the next round in Argentina, while over at Ligier they had registered 3 drivers for the race, with Jean-Pierre Jabouille travelling out to Brazil, having done some testing at the Lotus circuit in France, but still unsure how his ankles would stand up to the rigours of a full race. Car number 4, Ricardo Zunino. Editing Matt here. I've just noticed as I come to do the graphics for this that there is no tilde on the second N in this chap's name. He's not Zunino, he's Zunino, and I've been reading it wrong all these years. I'm not going back and re-recording the whole thing, but I will amend my pronunciation for next time. Zunino's family were fairly well-off farmers from near the Chile-Argentina border, and young Ricardo began his racing life in touring cars at the age of 25, progressing in the national championship and being identified by the Automobile Club of Argentina as promising enough to dispatch to Europe in 1977 at the age of 28. He entered F2 with the Euro racing team, but found it tough going that first year, although a move to the Works March team improved things, and he scored his first point with a bravura drive in the rain at Pau. Things improved a bit in 1978, and a run of 5 points placings in the last 7 races left him on 7 points in joint 11th place. During 1979 he had hoped to get an opportunity to enter F1 with the BS Fabrications team who'd given Nelson Piquet a few races at the end of 1978 and were planning to build their own chassis for 1979, but instead they went into the Aurora F1 series and Ricardo joined them mid-season, driving an Arrows A1 to a win at Brands Hatch in August, as well as taking 2 poles and 3 fastest laps. He was promising enough that Bernie gave him a test at Brabham mid-season, and that proved his big break. He'd travelled as a fan to Montreal in September 1979 to watch the Canadian Grand Prix, and to stop by to say hi to Bernie, so when Niki Lauda dramatically left the team, Ricardo was there, available, and had even driven the car before. So he found himself driving instead of watching, wearing Niki's helmet and overalls until his own could be sent out. He qualified 19th, but drove a solid race to finish an admittedly distant 7th. It was enough to keep him on the team for the final round at Watkins Glen, where he did much better, qualifying 9th, but going off in monsoon conditions. He'd done enough for the team to offer him a contract for 1980. Things started well enough, 7th at home in Argentina and 8th in Brazil, but results started to drop off, and when he failed to qualify in Monaco, the writing was on the wall. After one more race in France, he was replaced with Hector Rebaque, but evidently the bridges were not entirely burned, and he was asked back to take the seat for the controversial 1981 South African Grand Prix when the Mexican was ill. Tyrrell are unlikely to be the place to relaunch his career, but he will hope to at least look like a solid option to anyone else in need of a driver. Car 14, Ricardo Londoño-Bridge. Born in Medellin, Ricardo began his racing career in the local stock car and speedway scenes. Accounts of his early life are a little sketchy, but he won championships in the 1970s in both of those categories before moving north to the US, taking part in the 12 Hours of Sebring and the Daytona 250 as part of the 1979 IMSA Sports Car Series. The following year, he raced at Daytona again and placed 7th overall and 2nd in his class, before entering the Can-Am season in a self-entered Lola T540. He did reasonably well, finishing in the top 10 6 times in the 9 races he entered, with the best result of 5th. With prospects of becoming the first Colombian driver to make an impact in motorsport, he was backed by the Colombian Coffee Growers Federation and others to go to Europe and enter the Aurora AFX series for a single race, where he finished 7th. So, promising, but not an obvious star, but with Mo Nunn desperate for cash after the withdrawal of Unipart sponsorship at the end of 1980, he was able to get himself entered for the Brazilian Grand Prix. So unknown was he to most in the paddock that some suspected the name Londoño-Bridge was some kind of pseudonym, and someone coming out of Medellin, Colombia with lots of cash from vague sources inevitably invited rumours of cartel involvement. Car number 25, Jean-Pierre Jabouille. Born in Nazi-occupied Paris in 1942, Jabouille began his racing career, as so many did in the 1960s, as a mechanic almost as much as a driver, maintaining and setting up his own cars as he progressed through French Formula 3, along the way making friends with Jacques Lafitte, who would later become his brother-in-law when the pair married sisters. Their driving careers took on different routes, though, and Jabouille rose quickly through the French Junior Series in the late 60s and early 70s, a scene heavily subsidised and encouraged by Renault and Alf, and therefore indirectly by the French state. As well as his efforts in single-seaters, Jabouille was also signed up by Renault's sports car division Alpine as a development driver and occasionally entered races for them or other French teams, co-driving a Matra to third at Le Mans in 1973 and 74. That latter year also saw him make a tentative F1 debut, failing to qualify his Frank Williams racing car's ISO Marlboro at Dijon, and having no better success in a Works Surtees in Austria. With Formula One teams not exactly queuing round the block to take him on, he left the Alpine setup and got support from Elf to build his own chassis in Formula 2, named the Elf 2, where he battled for the title with Jacques Laffite, ultimately coming second but also getting another F1 drive thanks to his Elf connections with Tyrrell at Paul Ricard, where he finally qualified, 21st, and brought it home, 12th and the last man on the lead lap. For 1976 he continued in F2 with his chassis, now called the Elf Jabouille, and took the title by a single point from René Arnoux in the Works Elf team. His experience as a chassis designer and development driver was the decisive factor in Renault approaching him to work on their new Turbo F1 project, and from there the story of his career was the same as that of the team. He scored his first points at Watkins Glen in 1978, his first pole at Kyle Army the following year, and then while Arnoux and Villeneuve were taking lumps out of each other at Dijon, he overcame cramps to take his and Renault's first win. Another followed in 1980, but he was becoming frustrated with the car's unreliability, and when Guy Ligier needed a new French driver to replace Didier Pironi, he accepted the offer to rejoin his brother-in-law Laffite, only to break both legs in a colossal shunt at Montreal a few weeks later. With Jarier filling in until he was fully fit, Jabouille knows he needs to take things slowly. With the circuit only having been used once 3 years ago, there were extra familiarisation sessions. On Wednesday, Riccardo Londoño-Bridge actually did okay, his time's in the middle of the order, but he managed to annoy Keke Rosberg by getting in his way. The Finn pulled in front and brake-checked the Colombian, who went into the back of him and punted him off. That evening, Riccardo was informed that he would not be granted a super licence, his culpability for that accident cited as the reason, though subsequently it would emerge that Bernie Eccleston had found out that quite a lot of Londoño's money came from one Pablo Escobar, for whom he'd been involved in trafficking drugs. F1 has never exactly been shy about taking money from dodgy characters, but the Medellin cartel was perhaps one step too far, and he was out. Mark Sierra, meanwhile, was hanging around in the hope of doing a bit of networking, maybe picking up a drive somewhere else. He came back to his hotel from a night on the Caipirinhas on Thursday to find Mo Nern in need of a driver, and he was rehired, driving the car with Londoño's money and all his sponsor stickers still on the car. Friday qualifying got underway with Reutemann top, while Jabouille completed a few laps but decided his ankles still weren't up to it, so his entry was withdrawn and Jarier would do what he could on Saturday. Jumper still unhappy at being treated as a substitute. The turbos were expected to dominate in Brazil, but it was the Brabham suspension that made the difference in the end, while Villeneuve was bemoaning the fact that the Ferrari was 15 km an hour faster on the straights but cornered like an oil tanker, and the Renaults were stricken with their usual unreliability. Gordon Murray finally got the Brabham set up just right, and Piquet went round like he was on rails to take a home pole position. Carlos Reutemann, 0.3 seconds behind, was the only other driver in the same postcode. Jones fought understeer to third, and Patrese pulled out another excellent performance to line up fourth, just ahead of Prost, with Giacomelli out-qualifying his illustrious teammate in sixth. Villeneuve drove his barge to seventh, alongside Arnoux, who'd had to use Prost's car, with last year's Lotus lineup Andretti and De Angelis sharing row 5. This year's Lotus number 2, Mansell, was 13th, just behind Rebecca and Rosberg, while Watson did wonders in the old McLaren to park it 15th, ahead of Laffite. Pironi was back in 17th, starting alongside Sierra, restored to the ensign, with De Cesaris in the second McLaren 20th. Siegfried Storr qualified 21st, so he would make his race day debut. Jarier could only manage 23rd, sharing the back row with Ricardo Zanino's Tyrrell. Jan Lammers was driving the only chassis ATS had, which had been hastily patched up after Long Beach, but still wasn't right. Both Azellas were well off the pace, and the less said about the marches the better. Derek Daly failed to set a time at all after a suspension fell apart, leading team boss John McDonnell to tell the press, "This car is a pile of shit and that's official." Not encouraging. The clamour of the Brazilian press was such that Nelson Piquet and his good friend Eddie Cheever headed off somewhere quiet south of Rio to get a bit of peace the night before the race, but on Sunday morning the heavens opened. It didn't dampen Brazilian enthusiasm, which was also lifted by Emerson Fittipaldi putting in a few laps in one of his team's F8s, as this was his first Brazilian Grand Prix since his retirement from driving in F1. By the time the cars lined up on the grid, the rain had eased off to a drizzle, but the track was still very wet and most drivers were starting on grooved tyres. Piquet, though, thought the track would dry quickly and opted to go for slicks, as did Pironi and Storr, both far enough back that they might as well gamble. In Pironi's case, given the poor handling of the Ferrari in ideal conditions, it was certainly a bold choice. Incidentally, the footage I have from this race, along with many of those from the 80s, comes from a Japanese rebroadcast in the mid-2000s, which sent me down an entire rabbit hole of researching the names of the drivers as written in katakana. For some reason they leave the team names in Latin script for the captions, and also listening to the commentary, finding myself fascinated by how much of the vocabulary around racing appears to just be in English. Anyway, digression aside, they all lined up for the start. Again, the whole "we want you in two nice neat lines" memo didn't appear to have entirely got through, as Piquet lined up in the centre of the track. And of course on slick tyres, when the lights went green, that just allowed the two Williamses to go one either side, with Patrese following Reutemann through into second. While behind them in the spray there was a bit of a kerfuffle, as Villeneuve knocked his front wing askew on the back of Prost's Renault, sending Arnoux spinning to avoid them and taking out Serra on the way, while Andretti cannoned into the back of Villeneuve's Ferrari, bounced and landed back on the track, while in a separate incident Rosberg hit Cheever, Storr pinballed off Serra into Rebecca, and De Cesaris avoided the whole thing by taking to the grass. When the spray had settled, Andretti, Arnoux and Serra were all out. As they all tiptoed round the first lap, Jones was worrying at Patrese and nipped through into second going into turn 10, and they finished the lap with the Williamses running 1 and 2. Well, 2 and 1, with Patrese third, then Giacomelli, De Angelis and Rosberg in the top 6, and Villeneuve, Prost, Serra and Watson making up the top 10. Piquet, meanwhile, had dropped right back to 15th by the end of the lap as he slithered around on his slick tyres, with Pironi and Storr 19th and 20th. The conditions were certainly tricky. Tombe chucked his Theodore into the gravel towards the end of the first lap, but managed to keep it going and rejoin 18th. Thanks to that start-line schmozzle, the top three had an enormous lead, and on lap 2 came past Cheever limping back to the pits for repairs after his part in it, and once Jones was past Patrese, the arrows also started dropping back from the Williams pair. Soon they were all lapping the other arrows, Storr, who was also tiptoeing around on slicks, while behind them and off-camera, De Angelis had taken 4th off Giacomelli, who was suffering from an ignition problem. He came in on lap 7 to have his coil changed, an operation which kept him in the pits for several laps. Jarier, meanwhile, had overtaken Lafitte to take 11th place, and by lap 6 the rain had stopped and the beginnings of a dry line were appearing in places, particularly along the long Junson-Bach straight. Villeneuve, having decided to keep going with his wonky front wing, was up to 6th after Giacomelli dropped away, close behind Rosberg but with Watson right on his tail. Meanwhile, in the other Ferrari, Pironi, still toiling away in 18th, went a lap down to the Williamses, who breezed past on the straight, providing a great illustration of how it doesn't matter how much power you have if you can't put it on the road. Villeneuve finally came in to have his nose changed and rejoined 16th just in time to be lapped. Despite the rain having stopped, the flat track was draining slowly, and while the dry line was definitely emerging now, it still wasn't time to change to slicks, but it was time to start moving offline and finding wet patches to cool the tyres. The top 4, Reutemann, Jones, Patrese and De Angelis, looked fairly solid, but behind them there was a little knot of cars, Watson now 5th, leading Rosberg, Serra and Jarier, as they all lapped the much-delayed Giacomelli, and Jarier slipped past Serra in the process. With a point to prove, Jarier then set about taking 6th place off Rosberg, as Watson started to reel in De Angelis. And on lap 16, the Ligier was up into the points, outbraking the Fittipaldi into the corner, coming off the back straight. Whether Rosberg had a problem or had just been a bit discombobulated by Jarier, he soon found himself under attack from Serra, another driver with a point to prove. Behind them were Lafitte and Prost, also running close together. As the cameras moved on to watch De Angelis lapping Storr, which the director may have thought was him taking 3rd off Patrese, Serra finally overcame stiff resistance from Rosberg to take 7th place on lap 18. The Finn definitely had some kind of problem, as he was now coming under attack from Prost and Lafitte, battling each other as they overhauled Rosberg, and then came to lap Pironi as well. Through went the Renault as Pironi moved over, but on slick tyres he hit a wet bit and aquaplaned right into Prost, taking them both out. While everyone's attention was on the two Frenchmen climbing unharmed out of their cars, Lafitte was the next one to pass Rosberg. That was lap 20, and Prost and Pironi were just the 5th and 6th retirements. There'd been the initial 3 from the start line for a car, and then Andrea de Cesaris's engine had died on lap 10, so there were still 17 cars running, though in the case of Bruno Giacomelli, running was debatable, as he was last and back in the pits and didn't look like going anywhere soon. Watson, still in 5th, was under attack from a fired-up Jarier, with Sura also approaching the pair in search of a point. It was a good job there was plenty of action down the field, because Reutemann and Jones were simply dominant in the lead, circulating a couple of seconds apart, with Patrese now also completely on his own, 30 seconds behind Jones and almost the same ahead of De Angelis, who was likewise comfortably ahead of Watson and only seeing any action when he lapped someone. Having been almost entirely irrelevant to the race so far, meanwhile, Villeneuve came in to retire with a failure on his turbo wastegate on lap 25. Jarier and Watson, both old hands at this sort of thing, provided plenty of entertainment as they diced over 5th place, the Ulsterman wringing a pretty decent performance out of the old car and keeping the Ligier behind him. Off-camera, Tombe in 10th had come to lap Storr's arrows but made contact, spinning the Italian off into the barriers and out of the race. Local hero Piquet, probably by now regretting his tyre choice, had advanced to 12th of the 16 cars still on the track, and he was right behind Mansell, while the other Brabham, already several laps down, toured into the pits, Ribacchi having damaged his suspension in an off-track excursion, and he retired. Lafitte, meanwhile, was occasionally having to ease off his attacks on Watson in order to defend against Sura, who was going great guns in the ensign. Piquet finally got past Mansell on lap 28, and not long afterwards Sura took 6th off Jarier at the end of the Jonson Straight, with Lafitte also hitting by off-camera. Sura immediately set about Watson, with both Ligiers now queued up behind, and with the top 4 in no danger of providing anything entertaining to watch, this little group in 5th through 8th places were the best veering on track. As the track dried out, Jarier was finding his Ligier more and more understeery, while Sura was really having at Watson. The Ulsterman was really on the edge, the back of his M29F repeatedly stepping out on the slippery track. He was almost drifting it round some corners, but he was holding Sura back, whatever the Swiss driver tried. Eventually, though, on lap 35, either the pressure told or what he just got unlucky, swapped ends and went spinning off into the grass. He did rejoin, but some distance behind Sura and the Ligiers. Freed from behind Watson, Sura now set off in pursuit of De Angelis, setting what would turn out to be the fastest lap of the race on lap 36, the first fastest lap for both Sura and Ensign. The track was finally dry enough by now that Piquet was also advancing, disposing of Tombe and Rosberg to go up to 9th, but what he really needed was for everyone to start coming in to switch to slick tyres, and there was still no sign of that happening. Sura was setting such a pace with the Ligiers in tow that he soon caught up with De Angelis, who was suffering from a slow puncture and a dicky shock absorber, while Piquet was lapping his old teammate Zaninho, who was running in formation ahead of Chiva. Nelson was starting to approach the back of the De Angelis, Sura, Lafitte, Jarier group, and the Brazilian crowd started to believe he might at least grab a point, but then it started raining again, and he had a spin, recovering just in time to be lapped by the Williamses. While the cameras were watching that, and occasionally an empty track, Sura passed De Angelis for 4th, and with the return of the rain, Jarier's car started behaving better, and he got back ahead of Lafitte, and tried in turn to get past De Angelis, who was fighting both car and conditions as well as Jarier, as the race entered its closing stages. Piquet was having a dreadful time in the rain, spinning again on the start-finish straight as the De Angelis-Jarier battle came by. By now it was becoming obvious that the race would hit the 2-hour limit, and doing some swift calculations, the teams realised that the last lap would be 61 or 62. So on lap 56, the Williams team hung out a pit board reading Jones Reut, an instruction to Reutemann to let Jones pass to take the win. Down the pit lane at Ligier, Gérard Ducarouge held out a similar sign instructing Jarier to let Lafitte through so that he would score that last point for 6th place. Leadfoot was still harassing De Angelis for 5th at the time, while Lafitte was a couple of seconds behind, so neither driver who had been told to let their teammate pass was exactly in the mood to do so. After a couple of laps blocking Lafitte to prove a point, Jarier complied on lap 60, but Reutemann showed no signs of slowing. On the contrary, he sped up, setting his personal fastest lap of the race on lap 61, and at that point the boards went out indicating that lap 62 would beat the last. Reutemann came in to take a dominant lights-to-flag victory, with a furious Jones following him just over 4 seconds behind. Patrese was a lonely third, a minute behind Reutemann, and in the end Marc Surer was just 14 seconds behind the Arrows, so if the race had gone any longer he might have even ended up on the podium. Even so, 4th place and the fastest lap represented Enson's best ever result. Thanks to the Ligier's team orders forcing Jarier to back off, De Angelis held on to 5th place, and 2 points after a very difficult afternoon, and Lafitte took the final point as instructed, with Jarier 7th and the last man unlapped. Watson was 8th, then Rosberg and Tombe, Mansell 11th and Piquet 12th and 2 laps down after a home race to forget. Riccardo Zunino, 5 laps adrift in the Tyrrell, was the last classified finisher, with Chiva and Giacomelli both still running but unclassified. Bruno was 22 laps down, having spent almost as much time in the pits as he did on the track. Reutemann arrived at the podium for the prize-giving ceremony to find a cheerful Patrese, celebrating just his 3rd podium finish, but a total absence of Alan Jones. As Riccardo sprayed the champagne, while Reutemann's hands were full of trophies, the Argentine beamed. It was now open war between Lola, his team, and his teammate. Frank Williams, there to receive the trophy for winning constructor, berated him publicly, though the microphones didn't catch his actual words. Later, Reutemann offered a couple of half-hearted justifications. He said he hadn't seen the Jones-Reut pitboard, or he'd intended to let Jones through on the next lap at the end of the race, caught him out, but nobody really believed him. It seemed that Lola had decided that with a dominant car, and Jones having won last year, it was his turn in 1981, and damn his orders and contract, he was going for the title. Many of the other drivers were sympathetic. Jones, predictably, was not. I'd like to think that when he shake hands and sign contracts on a cold December morning, the other guy doesn't pretend a couple of months later that it never happened. If he didn't like his contract, he shouldn't have signed it. Reutemann was unrepentant, but in a later interview he said, "He had reason to be upset. I can't disagree with that, and it did affect our relationship afterwards. I saw the signal 3 laps from the end and I knew the terms of the contract, but still I was in a dilemma. From the beginnings of my career, I always started every race with the intention of winning it, but now I was being asked to give it away, just like that. If I give way, I thought to myself, I'll stop the car here and now in the middle of the track and leave immediately for my farm in Argentina. Finished, not a racing driver anymore." By way of a coda, Riccardo Londoño-Bridge was next heard of in August at a Formula 2 race at Donington Park, where the records show that he qualified 23rd of 29, didn't take the start, and that his chassis, a Tollman TG280, was never entered in another race, so we can surmise he pranged it pretty badly, thanks to Forex.com for that little nugget. In later life he returned to Colombia and got involved with the cartels again, acting as a transport consultant, selling aircraft, cars and boats to traffickers, and acquiring the nickname Cuchilla, razor. In 1998, a whopping 1,200 kilos of cocaine was found in one of his properties, which led to the seizure of most of his assets by the Colombian government, and he was killed in a gang shooting in 2009. Reutemann had timed his rebellion well. The next race was at home in Buenos Aires, where he enjoyed massive popular support, so if Frank Williams was entertaining any notions of firing him for breach of contract or something like that, he would be wise to hold off a bit at least.